Night settles like ink over the English countryside. It is late spring 1943. At a remote airfield in the Midlands, under a sky streaked with the last traces of twilight, a captured German aircraft rests beneath heavy tarpaulins. Its nose, an angular lattice of metal rods, juts forward like an insect's antennae, catching the dim beam of a guard's lantern. The aircraft is a Junkers Ju-88R1, a night fighter of the Luftwaffe. But this one did not fall in flames. It landed, intact. The crew, deserters, defectors, or simply confused, had flown it across the North Sea, pursued by their own side, and set it down on British soil. Now, the hum of generators cuts through the still air. Engineers from the Telecommunications research establishment, the secretive British radar laboratory at Malvern, move around the captured plane like surgeons preparing for an autopsy. Clipboards in hand, they trace cables from the nose array back to a strange black box bolted behind the cockpit. The markings read, Fuji 202, Liechtenstein, BC. When the first current flows through it, a green glow fills the oscilloscope, a heartbeat of light, a signal. For the first time, Britain can see through the eyes of Germany's night fighters. What the engineers uncover over the next few days will shatter long-held assumptions about the Luftwaffe's capabilities. They will realize that the enemy's airborne radar is not crude or experimental. It is years ahead in design and discipline. And as the hum of that set fades into the Midlands night, one truth becomes clear. This discovery will transform the invisible war in the skies. From this moment, the darkness itself will become a weapon. The captured Ju-88 was the beginning of a new phase in the air war. One fought not by bombs or bullets, but by frequencies and reflections. Europe in darkness by 1940. The world had learned a new dimension of fear. War fought in the dark. When daylight favored the defender, the night became the bomber's ally. The British Royal Air Force, battered during the day by the Luftwaffe's superiority in 1940, turned to the cover of darkness to strike back at the Reich. Yet darkness was not mercy. It was uncertainty. Crews flying Wellingtons and Hamptons stumbled through the black void of northern Europe with crude navigation and almost no defense against the unseen enemy. The night sky was alive with flak bursts and converging searchlights. But it was the silent, unseen attackers, German night fighters, that began to cut through bomber command formations like shadows with teeth. These early interceptions were primitive yet devastating. German ground operators, watching the glowing traces of bombers on their radar screens, would guide Messerschmitt Bf-110s into the paths of the British formations. Pilots peered into the dark, searching for the dull orange glimmer of exhaust flames. It was a deadly game of proximity and patience. But behind this crude choreography, Germany's scientists were building something far more sophisticated. The birth of the night defense system in 1940. Under the guidance of General Joseph Kammhuber, the Luftwaffe began constructing a vast air defense network, the Kammhuber Line. It was a chain of defensive boxes stretching from Denmark to northern France, each monitored by ground-based radar, Freya and Würzburg sets, anti-aircraft batteries, and a pair of night fighters held on alert. Each Himmelbett, or canopy bed, sector could lock onto intruding bombers and guide fighters into precise interception zones. At first, this system relied entirely on ground direction. Fighters flew blind until the last seconds, when they might glimpse their target illuminated by searchlights. But by 1941, German scientists began experimenting with something revolutionary: airborne radar. If radar could ride inside the fighter, the hunter would no longer depend entirely on the ground. It could seek, stalk, and strike alone. Britain's parallel struggle across the Channel. The British faced their own technological odyssey. At the secret establishment in Worth Matravers, later moved to Malvern, the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, worked feverishly on the problem of airborne interception. Their AI Meke I4 radar, though groundbreaking, had limited range and reliability. Each set filled half the aircraft and required 2 or 3 operators to interpret the faint green blips that meant life or death. By 1942, Bomber Command had begun large-scale night raids. Cologne, Lübeck, and Hamburg were reduced to smoking ruins. But each success came at a staggering cost. Loss rates of 5 to 7% per raid were considered acceptable. In practice, that meant entire squadrons vanished in a single night. The air war had become an invisible duel of radar, countermeasures, and deception. Britain's early G navigation system, which allowed more accurate bombing, was soon jammed by the Germans. In turn, British scientists developed OBO and H2S, a radar system that painted the ground beneath the bomber. Each innovation was answered, each advantage temporary. Still, one mystery haunted the Allied radar experts. How were German night fighters finding their bombers so effectively? Wreckage from downed aircraft revealed fragments of antennas and metal arrays, but never enough to reconstruct the full device. Reports from surviving crews spoke of being hunted in absolute darkness, without searchlights, without ground guidance. Something was inside those fighters, something unseen. Hints from the shadows in late 1942, RAF reconnaissance photographs began showing unfamiliar shapes on the noses of German night fighters, spidery masts or rods, aligned like a forked cage. Intelligence officers suspected it was a form of radar, but no one knew its wavelength, range, or precision. Intercepted Luftwaffe communications hinted at a new system called Liechtenstein. The name sounded almost whimsical, but its effect was lethal. By early 1943, British bomber losses climbed alarmingly. Over the Ruhr, the black heart of Germany's industry, bomber crews reported unseen attackers closing in from astern. Many never returned. Analysts at High Wycombe, headquarters of Bomber Command, watched the statistics rise and felt an unease they could not yet quantify. If the Germans truly had airborne radar, then the entire British night bombing strategy, built on the illusion of darkness as protection, was in jeopardy. The urgency to know inside TRE, the search for answers grew desperate. Scientists like Dr. Alec Reeves and R.V. Jones pushed for new methods of gathering intelligence. British commandos scoured crash sites in occupied Europe, hoping to salvage fragments before the Germans could destroy them. At one point, an almost intact Bf-110 was recovered in the Netherlands, but its radar had been stripped clean. Every rumor, every photograph, every intercepted phrase was analyzed, compared, and debated in late-night meetings under blackout curtains. R.V. Jones later recalled, "We were not merely fighting men, but frequencies, each one a potential death sentence if we misunderstood it." The British needed a miracle, a complete aircraft intact with its radar unscathed. Only then could they measure, replicate, and exploit the enemy's secret eyes. That miracle came in the form of a defecting crew, and a machine that landed whole on British soil. The turning of the tide begins. In the pre-dawn hours of May 9, 1943, a Ju-88 R1 from Nachtjagdgeschwader 3 approached Scotland under the pretext of a navigational training flight. Inside, Oberleutnant Heinrich Schmidt and his radio operator had resolved to defect. They were disillusioned with the war, with the futility of endless defense against overwhelming bomber streams. Fuel low and hearts pounding, they crossed the North Sea and descended toward the coastal airfield of Dice, near Aberdeen. The tower expected a British aircraft. What landed was anything but. British ground crews surrounded the sleek twin-engine machine, guns drawn, unsure whether it was a trap. But the German crew emerged with hands raised. The aircraft was untouched. More importantly, its radar, the elusive Fuji-202 Liechtenstein BC, was intact. Within hours, orders came down from the highest levels. The plane was to be transported under guard to Farnborough, and then to Malvern, for immediate technical dissection. A hidden war of scientists. For the engineers at Malvern, the arrival of the Ju-88 was a revelation. Here, at last, was the tangible proof of what they had theorized and feared. They worked in secrecy, no press, no leaks, not even interdepartmental chatter. The first task, power up the system without destroying it. German equipment was notoriously sensitive. its circuits unlike anything in British service. When they succeeded, the green trace on the cathode ray tube pulsed steadily, an echo of life in the dark. They measured its frequency, around 490 megacycles, corresponding to a wavelength of 61 centimeters. It operated with remarkable precision, detecting targets up to 4 kilometers away. More astonishing still, the entire system weighed only about 70 kilograms, compact enough to fit neatly into the fighter's nose compartment. British AI radar, by comparison, was bulky and fragile. It was a sobering discovery. The Luftwaffe had achieved true airborne radar capability earlier than most British experts believed possible. Their crews could hunt independently, even beyond ground radar coverage. The very concept of the night sky as a safe haven was unraveling. But discovery works. Both ways, from the moment the set was switched on, a new race began. Not of aircraft, but of frequencies. British scientists now had the numbers. They knew what to jam, how to listen, and where to strike. The intelligence gleaned from that single aircraft would soon ripple through Bomber Command, shaping countermeasures that could blind the very system it revealed. The discovery of the Liechtenstein radar did not merely inform engineers, it changed the operational logic of the war itself. The stage was now set for a collision between two unseen worlds, German precision and British improvisation, and at its center stood a captured machine, humming quietly in a hangar, as the next chapter of electronic warfare began to unfold. Escalation in the shadows. By early 1943, the night war had matured into a contest of sophistication rather than brute force. The Luftwaffe's Nachtjagdgeschwader units, specialized night fighter wings, had honed their craft under relentless British raids. Pilots like Heinz Wolfgang Schnauffer, Helmut Lent, and Martin Drews were becoming legends in the darkness, guided by the precision of Himmelbett control and the quiet glow of their onboard radar. At the same time, the RAF's Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, was intensifying the offensive. Harris believed that sustained bombing could break German morale and cripple industrial capacity. The strategy was simple: attack the heart of the Reich, again and again, until nothing remained but rubble. But every new phase of the campaign forced the Luftwaffe to adapt, and they did so with remarkable ingenuity. The Kammhuber line, once a series of isolated boxes, expanded into a vast lattice of overlapping coverage. As British bombers crossed into Europe, they passed through layers of radar detection. Freya picked them up at long range, Würzburg refined their position, and Himmelbett stations coordinated the intercepts. Now with airborne radar like Liechtenstein, German fighters could hunt even when the ground picture broke down. It was a fortress of radio waves, invisible yet lethal. Inside the fortress, each Himmelbett zone operated like a precision machine. A bomber crossing its boundary would be detected by ground radar, its course plotted, and a night fighter scrambled. The fighter would climb to altitude, guided by radio instructions until it came within range of its own onboard radar. At that moment, the radar operator, the Bordfunker, took over. Peering into his scope, he would see a small pulse move across the screen. When the pulse doubled, he knew he was closing in. A few seconds later, the pilot would see it too. The faint red glow of British exhausts shimmering in the night. Then a short burst of cannon fire. Another bomber down, another crew lost without ever seeing their killer. For 2 years, this system held firm. But by mid-1943, subtle cracks began to appear. Not from the skies above Germany, but from the laboratories of Britain. The defector's gift. The capture of the Ju-88R1 at Dice was a turning point. Its radar was not a prototype. It was standard issue for frontline night fighters. The Liechtenstein BC set, with its crossed matrix antennas, operated in the UHF band, giving exceptional resolution and reliability. The British engineers were astonished not just by the electronics, but by the precision of German craftsmanship. Vacuum tubes, connectors, and even the calibration marks reflected a meticulous design philosophy. They disassembled the set piece by piece, photographing and sketching every circuit. Scientists at TRE and the Royal Aircraft Establishment collaborated to test its beam patterns and output strength. Soon, a classified report circulated among a handful of senior officers. The conclusion was stark. The enemy's airborne interception radar is of a quality and stability superior to any yet in our possession. Countermeasures must be developed immediately. Within weeks, Liechtenstein sets were being operated under controlled test flights by RAF crews. Their signals were recorded, their modulation analyzed, and their vulnerabilities mapped. Out of this data came the first real understanding of how to defeat the system. Countermeasures in motion armed. With the knowledge from the Ju-88, British engineers began crafting responses. The first was Carpet, a broadband noise jammer designed to flood the frequency band used by Liechtenstein. It emitted a curtain of static that could mask bomber echoes or confuse enemy operators. Next came Serrate, a daring idea conceived by the Royal Air Force's Fighter Interception Unit. If the Germans were transmitting radar signals, those emissions could be tracked. By tuning a receiver to the Liechtenstein's frequency, British night fighters could home in on the very aircraft sent to intercept them. It was an inversion of the hunter-prey relationship, a dark mirror of technology turned against its maker. These new tools were still in development, but the foundation had been laid by that single captured aircraft. Tension. Between commanders, yet not everyone in Britain's command structure grasped the magnitude of this discovery. To men like Arthur Harris, obsessed with tonnage and city targets, radar warfare seemed abstract, a scientist's duel removed from the visceral business of destruction. But to others, including Air Marshal Sir Sholto Douglas and intelligence chiefs like R.V. Jones, the electronic war was becoming the key to survival. Meetings grew tense. Should resources go to more bombers or to more jammers? To better radar or to more bombs? The scientists argued that without understanding and countering German radar, every bomber built would simply feed the night fighter kill lists. Slowly, their voices prevailed. The invisible front expands by late summer 1943. The war in the air was being fought on wavelengths as much as on wings. The first window missions, dropping clouds of aluminum strips to confuse radar, had already disoriented German defenses during Operation Gomorrah, the firebombing of Hamburg. Now, with the data from the Ju-88, new generations of electronic deception were being tested nightly. For the Luftwaffe, the darkness that had once been their shield was turning against them. Pilots reported jamming on their scopes. Controllers at Himmelbett stations complained of ghost targets, false returns, and radio interference. The British were learning fast. Every new device was tested in combat, refined, and redeployed. It was a feedback loop of ingenuity born from desperation, and at the heart of it all was that captured night fighter. It's a dismantled radar whispering secrets that would soon echo across the European sky. The contest was no longer between bombers and fighters alone. It had become a war of scientists, waged in laboratories by men who never saw the battlefield, but whose equations and circuits decided who lived or died above the clouds. The darkness was now alive with signals, deception, and silence. Soon, Britain would strike back, not with brighter lights, but with blackout brilliance. The stage was set for the next chapter, the human, tactical, and technological angles of how this discovery reshaped the night war. Angle A, human. The engineers and the air crews in the cold halls of Malvern. The war was fought in whispers and waveforms. The men who worked there were not warriors in the traditional sense. They carried pencils instead of pistols, oscilloscopes instead of rifles. Yet their responsibility was immense. Every calculation, every soldered joint might save or doom hundreds of airmen that night. They lived under blackout, often sleeping in offices or bunkers, surviving on tepid tea and exhaustion. The air was heavy with the smell of solder and burnt dust. When the captured Liechtenstein set arrived, they treated it with reverence, as if it were both relic and weapon. Some engineers confessed later that the first time they saw its heartbeat trace glow on the scope, they felt something close to awe. It was elegant. It was deadly. To understand it meant touching the enemy's mind. Meanwhile, in the airfields of Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and Norfolk, bomber crews prepared for night missions with a ritual mix of fear and fatalism. They joked, smoked, and wrote last letters. In the dark beyond the perimeter, they knew unseen hunters waited. German crews just like them, staring into radar scopes. The difference between survival and oblivion might be the work of those unseen men in Malvern, buried in waveforms. When the first reports filtered back that jamming might be working, that some German operators were seeing only snow and static, the relief was almost physical. Engineers wept quietly at their benches. The men who never flew had found a way to protect those who did. But human cost was everywhere. Many of those same engineers would later visit operational airfields to test their devices in flight. Some never returned. The sky, even when navigated by math, still demanded blood. The bond between scientist and airman was silent yet profound. One fought with circuits, the other with courage. Together, they began to shift the balance of the night. Angle B. Tactical. The anatomy of night interception. To appreciate the impact of the captured radar, one must first grasp how refined the German night fighting system had become by 1943. An RAF bomber crossing the Dutch coast entered a web of coordination. Ground-based Freya radar detected it at 120 kilometers. Operators plotted its course by grease pencil on glass boards. When the blip crossed a predefined line, the controller ordered 2 fighters to scramble from a nearby Himmelbett airfield. The fighters, usually Bf-110s or Ju-88s, climbed into darkness. Radio operators aboard received vector commands. Turn 30 degrees. Climb to 6,000. Below, ground radar tracked both fighter and bomber, merging them on the same plot. At roughly 4 kilometers separation, ground control gave a terse command. You have him. From then on, the fighter was alone. Inside the cockpit, the boardfunker switched on the Liechtenstein. A rhythmic sweep pulsed across the scope. When a return blip appeared, he called distances in clipped German. 3, 2, 1. The pilot adjusted throttle, eyes straining. In a second, he saw it. A ghostly glimmer of exhaust, the silhouette of a bomber. A short burst of cannon fire, a blossom of flame, and then only night. This system, meticulous, disciplined, layered, had been nearly impossible to defeat. British analysts admired its precision even as it destroyed their squadrons. But after the Ju-88 capture, Bomber Command could reconstruct every phase. They knew the frequencies, the ranges, the intervals of control. For the first time, they could see the choreography of their own destruction, and knowing that pattern meant breaking it. With new countermeasures, jammers, and feinting tactics, the RAF began to fracture the Himmelbett's rhythm. Fighters scrambled to ghosts. Controllers shouted into static. The elegance of the system became its weakness. It depended utterly on clean, clear signals. Now the air was full of false echoes. Precision dissolved into confusion, and confusion meant survival. Angle C. Technological. The Liechtenstein set and its mirror. When British engineers pried open the casing of the Fuji-202 Liechtenstein, they were stunned by the elegance of its design. Its frequency, 490 MHz, placed it far beyond what most British sets operated on at the time. The magnetron tubes, though primitive by the standards of later developments, were stable and carefully tuned. The display system was intuitive, optimized for combat use. By comparison, the RAF's AI Mekawar-4 radar was bulkier, less stable, and easily jammed by ground interference. The German device seemed purpose-built for simplicity under stress. The nose array, 4 cross-shaped dipoles forming the matratze, or mattress, gave the radar its distinctive look. It could detect a bomber-sized target within a cone roughly 30 degrees wide, at ranges up to 4 kilometers. That meant the German pilot could begin a pursuit from several miles away and close to firing distance before the bomber crew had any idea. They were being stalked. The British engineers meticulously documented each component, then replicated its signal in laboratory conditions. What they found was a steady pulse easily identifiable on spectrum analyzers, and that realization opened a door. If a radar emits, it can be heard. If it can be heard, it can be tracked. This principle led directly to the conception of Serrate, a receiver that could pick up the emissions from the Liechtenstein radar and guide RAF fighters straight to their German counterparts. It was poetic irony. The hunter's own signal became a beacon for the prey. In the evolving electronic war, every emitter risked becoming a target. Liechtenstein had given the Luftwaffe independence, but it had also betrayed them to their enemies. Technology had turned inward, devouring itself in feedback. Angle D. Countermeasure logic. From knowledge to weapon once. The British understood the architecture of Liechtenstein. The challenge was clear: blind it, confuse it, or make it dangerous to use. The carpet jammer was the first response, a simple idea, brutally effective. Instead of trying to outsmart the radar, it overwhelmed it with noise. Broad-spectrum transmitters aboard bombers filled the air with static, making real echoes vanish under a haze of interference. German operators complained that their screens snowed over. In the early tests, a single jammer aircraft could obscure the radar picture for kilometers around. But scientists wanted more precision. Enter Serrate. Developed by the brilliant and unassuming engineer FFE Yates, the Serrate system allowed RAF night fighters, mainly mosquitoes and bow fighters, to detect the emissions of German Liechtenstein sets and home in on them. It was one of the first examples of passive detection warfare. The Germans could no longer prowl the night safely. Their radar betrayed their position. A Serrate-equipped mosquito pilot later recalled, "You'd be flying blind, listening to the faint pulse on the headphones. When it grew stronger, you knew he was near. You turned until the pulse peaked, and there he was, a shadow against the stars." It was chillingly symmetrical. The hunted had learned to hunt the hunter. Every scientific discovery created a counter-discovery. As British bombers carried carpet jammers to disrupt, British intruders carried Serrate receivers to ambush. The result was chaos inside the Luftwaffe's night fighter command. Controllers found themselves deafened by noise, their fighters vanishing one by one into the dark. From May 1943 onward, electronic warfare had become the new front line. And it had all begun with a single aircraft, left intact by fate, and a few quiet men who listened carefully enough to hear the enemy's heartbeat. The lines between technology, tactics, and human will were now dissolving. Knowledge of the radar had changed not just machines, but minds. Commanders, engineers, and pilots began to think differently about warfare itself. They realized that victory at night would not come from courage alone, but from control of the invisible. And as those invisible battles grew in scale, leadership, politics, and philosophy would soon collide with science. Angle E. Leadership and institutions. Command in the age of invisible war. Discovery of the Liechtenstein radar threw a gauntlet across Britain's military bureaucracy. The traditional boundaries between service branches, laboratories, and commands were suddenly blurred by a technology that affected them all. At the top sat Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, whose single-minded drive for total destruction of German industry defined the RAF's strategy. He believed in overwhelming force, steel, flame, and morale collapse. To him, radar and jamming were secondary tools, not the core of warfare. But below him, in the quieter offices of Air Vice Marshal Edward Addison and R.V. Jones, a new kind of thinking was taking shape. War by science, fought with wavelengths and deception. The Telecommunications research establishment became the nerve center of that intellectual rebellion. Its scientists, many of them civilians, were protected by layers of secrecy, yet their influence began reaching into operational planning. They produced reports stamped most secret, arguing that without technological countermeasures, the bomber offensive would bleed itself dry. One report from mid-1943 warned, "The enemy's capacity for nocturnal interception exceeds current expectations by a factor of at least 3. Unless immediate counteraction is authorized, present loss rates will become unsustainable. Such language cut through even the thickest bureaucracy. By July 1943, special committees were formed to prioritize radar countermeasures. The TRE received direct funding, and liaison officers from Bomber Command were permanently stationed at Malvern. It was a quiet revolution, an acknowledgement that the age of purely mechanical warfare was over. On the German side, similar institutional tensions emerged. General Josef Kammhuber, architect of the Night Defense Network, found his once pristine system drowning in complexity. Each British innovation, window, carpet, serrate, forced new improvisations. He demanded new radars, wider coverage, more autonomy for night fighter units. Berlin hesitated. Industry was stretched. Hitler distrusted scientists who spoke of invisible weapons. The Luftwaffe's research hierarchy was fractured by rivalry. By late 1943, the German system that had once been a marvel of integration was showing strain. Coordination faltered, resources thinned, and the RAF's countermeasures exploited every weakness. The battle for the night sky was increasingly a battle of institutions, one open to innovation, the other shackled by its own success. Angle F, enemy adaptation, and the moral frontier. The Germans, though stunned by British countermeasures, were far from passive. By autumn 1943, new versions of the Liechtenstein radar, FUG-2212C1 and FUG-220SN2, entered service, operating at different frequencies to evade jamming. Their antennas grew larger, shifting to the iconic Stag's Antlers array seen on later Ju-88s and Bf-110s. For a few months, the balance tilted back. British carpet jammers, tuned to the old frequency, were ineffective. Losses climbed again, but the respite was brief. The British listening stations at Malvern and Daventry quickly identified the new frequencies and modified their jammers. The cat-and-mouse cycle resumed, each side chasing the other through the electromagnetic spectrum. This race bred a strange respect between adversaries. German engineers knew that somewhere across the channel, men they'd never met were dissecting their work and answering it with equal brilliance. The struggle was impersonal yet intimate, a dialogue of minds conducted through noise. But beneath the science lay a moral weight that neither side could ignore. The more effective the technology became, the higher the death toll rose. For Bomber Command, improved jamming meant deeper penetrations into Germany and more devastating raids. For the Luftwaffe, more precise radar meant intercepting hundreds of aircraft, burning cities illuminated by tracer and flame. Each innovation tightened the spiral of destruction. At the height of the night war, entire urban centers vanished beneath firestorms. Hamburg, Kassel, and Berlin suffered catastrophic losses. German civilians hid in cellars, hearing the hum of British bombers overhead. British families waited sleeplessly for their sons to return from those same skies. Technology, once celebrated as the rational triumph of human intellect, had become an instrument of mass annihilation. In later years, R.V. Jones reflected soberly. Each equation we solved seemed to light another city on fire. It was the paradox of modern warfare: knowledge granting power, and power consuming humanity. Still, for the men fighting in 1943, morality was a luxury of hindsight. Their world was narrowed to survival, cause, and duty. And as that duty deepened, the next phase of the struggle approached. The moment when British technology would no longer merely match the German radar, but decisively overturn it. The climax was near. The night when invisible victories became visible in flame and confusion over Europe. A night over the Reich by. The summer of 1943, Britain's bombers once again streamed across the North Sea. But this time the silence was deceptive. Hidden in their bellies and wings were the fruits of months of secret labor: carpet jammers, window dispensers, and serrate receivers. Each was born from that one captured Ju-88 and the green pulse of its radar scope. The crews didn't know the full story. They simply knew that scientists had given them a chance, a way to confuse the hunters waiting in the dark. The test would come over Hamburg Operation Gomorrah on the night of July 24, 1943. RAF Bomber Command launched what would become one of the most devastating air raids of the war, Operation Gomorrah. Nearly 800 bombers climbed into the darkness, their engines merging into a single vast hum. The city below would soon be consumed by a firestorm so intense that asphalt ran like water. But before that inferno came another kind of fire, the invisible kind. As the bomber stream approached the German coast, aircraft began dropping bundles of window. Millions of narrow aluminum strips cut precisely to half the wavelength of German radar. Each piece reflected a false echo, and together they created a blizzard on the radar screens. Ground controllers in the Kammhuber line watched in disbelief as their scopes filled with thousands of phantom targets. Their precise clockwork system had turned to chaos. Searchlights stabbed at empty air. Fighters scrambled blindly. In the confusion, British jammers began transmitting low, steady bursts of static that blanketed the Liechtenstein frequency range. Inside their cockpits, German radar operators saw their screens dissolve into snow. The heartbeat trace they trusted now beat wildly, erratically. The hunters were blind. The birth of the invisible advantage among the bomber crews. The difference was felt instantly. Many who had expected to face the usual storm of interceptions reported quieter skies, fewer night fighters. Wireless operators noted the absence of the dreaded warning calls. "Night fighters in the stream!" That usually came as losses mounted. At High Wycombe, where Bomber Command's operations room monitored the returning waves, officers watched the numbers. The loss rate, which had hovered near 7%, suddenly plunged to less than 3%. For Harris's headquarters, it was a revelation. For the first time, British bombers had turned the night into their domain. Far below, in the wreckage of German control centers, confusion spread like contagion. Communications collapsed between sectors. Radars contradicted one another. Fighters returned to base having seen nothing. The rigid Himmelbett system, dependent on coordination, had fractured under the weight of deception. General Kammhuber would later call those nights the collapse of order in darkness. Meanwhile, in the skies above France, while Hamburg burned, another experiment unfolded, not with bombers, but with hunters of hunters. At RAF Ford, a squadron of Mosquito night fighters stood ready. Their mission was not to defend Britain, but to invade the night defense network itself. Each aircraft carried the new Sarate receiver, its prototype components assembled from the data pulled from the Ju-88. Their pilots were among the most daring of the war. Men like Wing Commander Bob Bram, already an ace in daylight combat, now trained to stalk by invisible signals. Sarate allowed them to hear the faint pulse of German Liechtenstein radars. Each transmission a ghostly whisper in the headphones. When the signal grew stronger, they turned toward it. That night, several Mosquitoes crossed the French coast alone, silent and unseen. Within minutes, their receivers picked up the telltale rhythm of German night fighter patrols. Following the pulses, they closed the distance, until radar emissions filled their headsets with a steady beat. Then, eyes straining, they saw it. A twin-engine shadow, its antennas glinting faintly in starlight. The hunter had become the hunted. In a brief burst of cannon fire, the German fighter fell flaming into the dark countryside. It was the first confirmed Sarate kill. A tactical and psychological shift. What made these nights so decisive was not just the equipment, but the transformation of mindset they symbolized. For years, the British had flown reactively, defending against superior German technology, improvising under pressure. Now they were taking initiative. They had turned knowledge into offense. Sarate, though simple in concept, carried profound implications. Every time a German pilot switched on his radar, he risked broadcasting his position to British intruders. The very device meant to give him an edge had become a liability. Within weeks, reports from German night fighter bases began to reflect panic. Enemy aircraft detected near our patrol zones appears to home on our transmissions. Recommend radar silence except when directed by control. That recommendation was fatal. Without their radars, the night fighters lost their primary means of detection. The Luftwaffe's intricate defense grid was dissolving into fear and guesswork. Even Kammhuber himself admitted in a memo, "We are compelled to operate in radio silence, thereby neutralizing our greatest advantage." The irony was perfect and devastating. In the laboratories back in Britain, the men at Malvern tracked every report from the field. Each intercepted transmission, each captured radar set, fed their growing knowledge. They mapped German frequencies on vast charts, marking which bands were jammed, which had shifted. By late 1943, they realized that the enemy was changing sets, introducing the new SN2 radar at a lower frequency, roughly 90 MHz. The scientists smiled grimly. It would take only weeks to retune their jammers. The pace of innovation had become relentless. What once took months now took days. In this feedback loop, the engineers found both pride and dread. They had become indispensable but also complicit. Each success in blinding German radar meant another city could be bombed. Another crew might die. Yet none hesitated. They were racing time, and every hour counted. They knew the Luftwaffe was adapting. The question was whether Britain could stay one step ahead long enough to make that adaptation meaningless. Consequences. Measured in lives by the end of 1943, Bomber Command statistics told a story written in numbers rather than words. In May, before Window and Carpet, average loss rates on deep raids exceeded 6%. In August, after Hamburg, they fell below 3%. For a force flying hundreds of sorties per night, that difference meant thousands of men surviving who otherwise would have vanished. To the analysts at High Wycombe, those numbers were a vindication. To the engineers at Malvern, they were proof that understanding, the dissection of that single Ju-88, had altered the trajectory of the war. Yet the Luftwaffe was far from beaten. Its pilots remained formidable, its scientists quick to respond. The SN2 radar promised longer range and resistance to jamming. The next phase of the electronic duel was about to begin. Still, the strategic tide had shifted. The British now fought with confidence, their bombers protected by invisible shields of noise and deception. And in the quiet moments between raids, officers would look at the glowing dots on the plotting boards and think of that. Captured aircraft, its nose array, silhouetted in the hangar light, the machine that had turned ignorance into power. The war of metal and fire was becoming a war of logic and light. The next battles would test whether that logic could hold when Germany struck, back with its own wave of radar evolution, the return of the hunters. By the beginning of 1944, the skies over Europe had become a vast chessboard of invisible moves. The Germans had not been idle. Out of the laboratories at Rechlin and the Telefunken works came the Fuji 220 Liechtenstein SN2, a new radar set designed to beat carpet jamming and serrate tracking alike. Its lower frequency, longer wavelength, and redesigned antennas seemed to promise an end to British interference. In January, German night fighters returned to their patrols with renewed confidence. Crews reported clear signals and unobstructed detection for the first time in months. The Luftwaffe's propaganda service quietly celebrated a technological rebirth. For Bomber Command, losses began to climb again. The relief of late 1943 faded into grim familiarity. Harris was furious. He demanded answers. At Malvern, engineers scoured intercepted signals, searching for a new pattern. The air war had once again turned into a blindfolded duel, in which the advantage changed hands by the week. But the British were not the same force they had been in 1942. Now, they had listening stations stretching across Britain, Y-service outposts that monitored the airwaves from Norway to Bavaria. Within days, analysts detected a new pulse, lower, slower, broader. The enemy's new radar had betrayed itself the moment it began transmitting. The war of detection began anew. The counterblow by March 1944, new jammers tuned to the SN2's frequency were being installed on bomber aircraft. At the same time, the Mosquito intruders of numbered 100 Group, a newly formed special unit dedicated to electronic warfare, began receiving upgraded Serrate and the first versions of Perfectos, an advanced direction-finding receiver that could lock onto SN2's emissions with eerie precision. One Mosquito pilot described it later. "We could sense them before we could see them." The set hummed low when they were far, then quickened into a steady beat as we closed. "They never knew we were there until the tracers lit their wings." The hunter-hunted reversal had returned with a vengeance. At Eindhoven, Venlo and Westerwald, Luftwaffe ground crews watched as aircraft failed to return from missions. Reports filtered up the chain. Multiple losses under unclear circumstances. Possible British ambush. Kamhuber knew the pattern too well. The British had caught up again. Technology meets tactics, but technology alone was not enough. Both sides learned that tactics had to evolve alongside machines. The RAF bomber streams of early 1944 were no longer scattered drifts of aircraft, but tightly managed. Corridors, bomber lanes, defined by timing, altitude, and jamming coverage. Each lane was shielded by carpet noise and ghosted by window chaff. Every bomber carried countermeasure specialists, trained to monitor interference and adjust equipment mid-flight. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe adapted in turn. Frustrated by the collapse of centralized control, they shifted to Zachme Sao tactics, tame bore, where night fighters were directed to the bomber stream en masse, then allowed to roam freely using their onboard radar. It was chaos turned into doctrine. For a few nights, the new tactic worked. German aces scored kills even amid jamming, but the cost was steep. Fuel, fatigue, and confusion multiplied. Then came the wild sow, wild boar tactics, in which single-seat fighters, originally designed for daylight use, were thrown into the night skies over burning cities, guided only by the flames below and the faint glow of radar beacons. The night became a theater of desperation, organized precision giving way to savage improvisation. British countermeasures exploited that desperation. The more the Germans relied on visual cues, the more window and carpet distorted their sense of reality. By mid-1944, many Luftwaffe squadrons reported kill claims that did not match any actual RAF losses. They were, quite literally, shooting at illusions. The duel at 20,000 feet in April 1944, one mission symbolized the new character of the war. A formation of Lancaster bombers crossed the Ruhr under carpet jamming, while a detachment of Mosquito intruders from No. 141 Squadron shadowed the route. Their Serrate sets came alive with the pulse of multiple SN2 radars converging from the south. The Mosquito leader, Flight Lieutenant Peter Nash, gave a simple order: track the loudest. They turned toward the strongest signal. Moments later, they spotted a Ju-88 climbing beneath the bomber stream, its antennae glinting in the moonlight. Nash's gunner fired a short burst. The Ju-88 exploded, its radar emissions silenced mid-pulse. 2 more German fighters fell that night, all betrayed by their own technology. Afterward, Nash wrote in his logbook, "It's strange. Their machines guide us to them like moths to their own flame." In that one sentence lay the essence of the electronic war. Each side illuminated itself in the act of seeing. The collapse of the line by mid-1944. The once formidable Kamhuber line was a shadow of its former self. Continuous jamming, false echoes, and shifting tactics had rendered its sectors meaningless. British raids penetrated deep into Germany with growing confidence. The combination of window, carpet, and Serrate, all descendants of the intelligence from that first captured Ju-88, had turned the Luftwaffe's night defenses into a labyrinth of blind corners. Kamhuber, increasingly isolated, argued for a complete redesign of the system. But it was too late. German industry, strained by Allied bombing, could no longer produce enough radar sets, spare parts, or trained operators to sustain the fight. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons, and yet, the night fighter crews continued to fly. Men of extraordinary skill and courage, battling not only enemies but physics itself. Their story, tragic and valiant, mirrored the British bomber crews they hunted, both trapped in a technological spiral that neither side could escape. The invisible victory. Victory in the electronic war was not celebrated with fanfare or parades. It came quietly, in statistics, in survival rates, in missions completed. By June 1944, as D-Day approached, RAF Bomber Command could operate over Normandy with minimal night fighter interference. The once terrifying odds of interception had dropped so low that Harris could focus on strategic support for the invasion. Behind that success lay the silent triumph of analysis, patience, and precision. The captured German night fighter had given the British a window into the enemy's soul, a map of its unseen world. From that understanding had come a cascade of inventions that reshaped the balance of air power. The British had not merely copied the enemy, they had transcended him. What began as a single defection in 1943 had evolved into the first true electronic battlefield, a realm where information was both weapon and shield. Echoes in the night. In the months that followed, fragments of German night fighters continued to fall across Europe. Their twisted antennae lay like broken spider legs in the ruins of airfields and forests. The war was moving toward daylight and jet propulsion, but the legacy of those nocturnal duels lingered. Veterans from both sides would later admit that by 1944, the night sky no longer belonged to either man or machine. It belonged to the invisible. The Liechtenstein's heartbeat, once the herald of doom, had become the pulse that taught Britain how to master darkness. And as dawn broke over Europe in the summer of 1944, the war that had begun in blinding light and smoke was now being decided by those who could fight unseen. The German night fighter radar had once represented dominance. Its capture transformed that dominance into vulnerability, and its imitation into innovation. But as victory drew near, another story began, the reckoning of what those victories had cost. For behind every jammed signal and every silent interception were cities burning, men lost, and a continent learning the price of technological supremacy. When the smoke cleared over Europe's burned-out cities, the scoreboards of Bomber Command told a story that could barely be seen in daylight. Between mid-1943 and mid-1944, the average loss rate of British night bombers dropped from 6 to 7% per mission to under 2%. On paper, that might look like numbers. In human terms, it meant thousands of crews, tens of thousands of men, coming home who would otherwise have vanished into the darkness. Those invisible survivors were the direct consequence of invisible weapons. The jammers, receivers, and counter-radar measures born from that captured Ju-88. For once, science had bent the curve of attrition in favor of life rather than loss. The success was not just operational, it was strategic. In the early years of the war, night fighting had been Germany's strong suit. The Himmelbett defense line was admired even by Allied analysts for its precision and coordination. But by late 1943, the system had imploded under the strain of deception. The Luftwaffe's night fighter arm, once the sharpest edge of its defense, was bleeding pilots faster than it could train them. The British had shifted the burden of fear. The hunters were now haunted. The numbers behind the night at Malvern and High Wycombe. Analysts compiled statistics with cold precision. In April 1943, before the capture of the Liechtenstein-equipped Ju-88, RAF night losses on deep raids averaged 6.2%. By December 1943, after the introduction of carpet, window, and serrate, losses had fallen to 2.9%. By March 1944, they were 1.8%, even as the size of the bomber streams nearly doubled. The Luftwaffe's records painted the other side of the equation. In 1943, German night fighter squadrons claimed over 4,000 RAF bombers destroyed. In 1944, that number collapsed to barely 1,400, and even those were achieved at crippling cost. One German pilot later recalled, "We could still find them sometimes, but when we turned on our sets, they found us faster." The balance of technological terror had tipped, and there was no turning it back. Industrial and strategic repercussions. The British success in deciphering and countering Liechtenstein had consequences far beyond the tactical level. For one, it forced the German radar industry into an exhausting spiral of adaptation. Telefunken and Lorenz, once the crown jewels of electronic engineering, were forced to redesign, retune, and reissue new radar models almost monthly. Each iteration consumed scarce materials, diverted skilled labor, and eroded standardization. Factories already strained by Allied bombing struggled to keep pace. Components ran short. The Luftwaffe began deploying mismatched systems, old and new radars mixed in the same squadrons, incompatible parts patched with field repairs. Maintenance crews complained that half their radar sets failed before combat. The once proud Himmelbett had become a jigsaw of compromise. Meanwhile, Britain's own radar sector bloomed. Malvern expanded into a sprawling nerve center, employing thousands. Laboratories at Swanage, Christchurch, and Worth-Matravers, once isolated, now collaborated on a unified electronic warfare program. Out of this surge came technologies that would endure long after the war. Microwave radar, navigation aids, early electronic surveillance. In a sense, the captured Ju-88 had not only changed a battle, it had accelerated an entire scientific revolution. Doctrine rewritten in real-time Bomber Command's tactics evolved just as quickly. With jamming and deception now reliable, formations grew tighter and more disciplined. Crews were trained to coordinate electronic countermeasures. A leading group would deploy window. Trailing aircraft would maintain carpet coverage. Specialized spoof squadrons flew diversionary routes to overload the German radar picture. For the first time, the bomber stream became a deliberate electronic formation, not just a mass of aircraft. The Luftwaffe, deprived of accurate tracking, tried to adapt with visual tactics and mass patrols, but every adaptation exposed new weaknesses. Pilots flying by moonlight or city glow were easier prey for Sarret-equipped intruders. The more fighters Germany put in the air, the more targets the mosquitoes found. The numbers were merciless. In the first half of 1944, RAF intruders destroyed or damaged over 200 German night fighters, often before those aircraft reached their patrol zones. The Luftwaffe's operational readiness plummeted. By June 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe's Night Fighter Corps was a shadow of its former self. Its ability to mount sustained defense over Western Europe had effectively collapsed. The British had turned information into air superiority. The shift from fear to confidence for the men of Bomber Command. This transformation was more than statistical. Veterans who had once dreaded night operations began to speak of a strange new calm. The dark skies that had once been hunting grounds for the enemy now seemed to favor them. "The air feels different," one navigator wrote in his logbook after a late 1943 raid on Leipzig. "You can almost sense that we are the ones invisible now." At briefing halls, squadron leaders no longer had to steel their men for slaughter. Instead, they spoke of precision, coordination, and technical advantage. It was still war, merciless, exhausting. But the helplessness of the early years was gone. Even the tone of official communiqué shifted. What had once been euphemisms for loss, missing, failed to return, were replaced by cautious phrases like defenses disrupted and results satisfactory. And in the laboratories, where so many breakthroughs had begun, morale soared. A war fought by scientists was no longer an oxymoron. It was a new kind of battlefield. The German realization, in Germany, however, the mood was turning grim. Kammhuber's meticulously designed defensive grid had become unmanageable under constant disruption. The introduction of window alone had forced the Luftwaffe to rewire entire radar sectors. By the time they adjusted, carpet jamming rendered the new frequencies useless. The final blow came when German intelligence confirmed the existence of Sarret. Captured British wreckage revealed the small, simple receiver, proof that the enemy could track their radar emissions. The shock was profound. Every advantage the Luftwaffe had built since 1940 now seemed compromised. Kammhuber's reports to Berlin became increasingly desperate. He begged for centralized control of radar development, for priority access to scarce electronic components. His proposals went largely unanswered. The German command, obsessed with wonder weapons like the V1 and V2, could not see that the true wonder weapon had already been lost: their command of the invisible spectrum. The aftermath of the Liechtenstein discovery was not a single victory, but a cascade, a silent chain reaction that unraveled an entire strategic doctrine. And as the Allies pressed their advantage through 1944, that unraveling would accelerate until Germany's night skies were no longer a fortress, but a corridor to defeat. The collapse of the night war. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's night fighter arm was in crisis. Fuel shortages, overworked crews, and the relentless loss of radar equipment had turned once elite units into weary remnants. The Kammhuber line, once the envy of Allied intelligence, had effectively ceased to exist as an organized system. Its radar network was fragmented. Its ground controllers were blind. German night fighter pilots still flew, but their missions were increasingly desperate. The airfields of Venlo, Bonn-Hangelar, and Paderborn sent up aircraft that were often half-fueled, their radar barely functional. Pilots carried orders to avoid prolonged emissions, a bitter irony for men whose survival depended on radar. For every night they took off, another handful of them never returned. British mosquito intruders patrolled the edges of the Reich like wolves, guided by Surratt and later by Perfectos and Boozer systems. They hunted the hunters, circling airfields, striking as German fighters tried to land. Entire squadrons lived in fear of being ambushed during approach. The men of No. 100 Group RAF, who flew these missions, called it the Shadow War. Their task was not glory, it was attrition. Destroy the enemy's night fighter force, make the bomber lanes safe. They succeeded with ruthless efficiency. By the turn of 1945, the Luftwaffe's night fighter losses had exceeded 50% of its operational strength. The surviving crews were exhausted, and many had lost faith in their equipment. As one German radio operator wrote bitterly in his diary, "Our eyes in the night have gone blind. We fly by instinct and prayer." Technology outruns its creators. Ironically, the pace of technological innovation had by now surpassed the capacity of either side to keep up. The British were developing centimetric radar and advanced microwave sets, devices whose clarity and power rendered the old UHF-based systems obsolete. The Germans, meanwhile, were experimenting with Neptune and Berlin radars, some copied from captured Allied equipment, but the resources to mass-produce them simply no longer existed. The air war had entered an era where knowledge raced faster than logistics. The Liechtenstein radar, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, was now a relic, an artifact of an earlier phase of the war. Yet its influence persisted. The confrontation it sparked, the race between emission and counter-emission, had laid the foundation for what would soon be called electronic warfare. Malvern scientists began cataloging every frequency used by the enemy, building vast libraries of signal intelligence. From these grew post-war fields of radar warning, jamming doctrine, and airborne surveillance. The unseen revolution was underway before the war even ended. Strategic consequences. The impact on Allied strategy was profound. By neutralizing the Luftwaffe's night defenses, Bomber Command achieved something that daylight operations by the U.S. 8th Air Force could not always guarantee: penetration deep into Germany with sustainable losses. From late 1944 into 1945, British bombers struck with increasing impunity at oil refineries, transport hubs, and industrial cities. The night skies once ruled by German interceptors now belonged almost entirely to the Allies. When the Allied invasion of Normandy succeeded in June 1944, it was supported by this invisible dominance. RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces could stage deceptive raids, flood the airwaves with false radar echoes, and prevent German fighters from massing effectively. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the Luftwaffe's night fighter defense had become symbolic, brave men flying blind for a regime collapsing beneath them. The radar race that began with one captured Ju-88 had contributed directly to the breaking of German resistance in the West. The men who made it possible, Few of the individuals behind the discovery ever sought fame. At Malvern, men like R.V. Jones, Sir Bernard Lovell, and Alec Reeves simply returned to academia after the war, their achievements buried under the Official Secrets Act. Many would go on to shape the modern world of telecommunications, radio astronomy, and electronics. R.V. Jones later described those years as a war fought in silence, where victories could never be announced. He wrote, "We fought the most secret battle of all, the one the public never saw, yet it was perhaps the one that mattered most." Their opposite numbers in Germany, engineers at Telefunken and Lorenz, had worked with equal brilliance, if not equal freedom. Some were later recruited by Allied powers under Operation Paperclip, their expertise fueling the Cold War's rapid advance in radar and missile guidance. Thus, the legacy of the night fighter radar extended far beyond the war that created it. What the records show, the intelligence archives declassified decades later confirmed what the engineers had suspected. The analysis of the captured Ju-88's Fuji-202 radar in May 1943 produced 5 immediate operational benefits: identification of its precise frequency band, 490 MHz, enabling focused jamming, creation of Surite, the first practical radar homing receiver, acceleration of carpet jammer production for RAF bombers, refinement of window to match the German radar's wavelength, foundational research for microwave, counter-radar, leading to post-war ECM design from a single aircraft, came an entire doctrine, electronic, countermeasures, ECM, that would dominate every future conflict from Korea to Vietnam to the modern day. What Britain learned from dissecting that radar was not merely how to jam the enemy, but how to think about war in terms of information flow. It was the birth of electronic dominance as a philosophy. The final missions, in the last months of the war, the night skies over Germany told a different story than they had in 1940. Where once radar-guided fighters roamed freely, now only scattered defenders rose against the endless tide of Allied bombers. Those who did fly often did so without working radar, relying on luck and the faint glow of flares. By February 1945, the British were bombing Dresden, Chemnitz, and Berlin with near-total impunity. The Himmelbett was gone. The Liechtenstein was silent. In its place stood the hum of Allied transmitters, the rhythmic sweep of centimetric radar scanning Europe from the air and sea. The night belonged to whoever controlled the signal. The quiet aftermath. When victory finally came in May 1945, there was no medal for the men of the invisible war, no parade for the engineers at Malvern. Their success was measured only in missions flown, in crews returned, and in the stunned silence of the German radar rooms they had blinded. The Ju-88 that had started it all remained at Farnborough for years, tested, studied, preserved. Its black box, the Fuji-202, was displayed in later decades at museums, its knobs and dials frozen in place, its once deadly glow now only a curiosity. Few who walked past it understood that this small device had changed the nature of warfare forever. The war of the night had ended, not with a shout, but with silence, the silence of jammers humming, of signals fading, of darkness reclaimed, and yet, that silence was victory. From its echo would come a new era, an age, where no battle could ever again be fought without the unseen war of electrons beneath it. The flames of Hamburg and the static of Malvern were two sides of the same truth. Control of the invisible had become control of destiny. The light inside the darkness. Every war invents its own kind of courage. In the Second World War, courage had many faces. The soldier in the trench, the pilot in the cockpit, the nurse in the ward. But there was another kind of courage, quieter and less visible. The courage to think, to question, to peer into the unseen. When British engineers stood around that captured German night fighter in 1943, they were not holding rifles. They were holding pencils, notebooks, and curiosity. Yet what they achieved with those tools changed the outcome of the night war more profoundly than any single battle. The Liechtenstein radar they discovered was a mirror, a reflection of what humanity can build when knowledge serves destruction. But it was also the catalyst for something greater. The realization that in modern war, information itself is the battlefield. From that moment, the fight for survival was no longer about who could fly faster or shoot straighter. It was about who could understand, who could see the patterns hidden within the noise. The war that taught us to listen. Before 1943, the night sky was a place of fear. By 1944, it had become a vast laboratory of signals. The RAF and the Luftwaffe had transformed it into the first electronic ecosystem of conflict, a space alive with pulses, echoes, and silence. That evolution marked a profound shift in how humans wage war. The air war over Europe began with metal and ended with mathematics. It taught a generation of soldiers and scientists that mastery of the invisible meant mastery of everything else. The same logic that guided those engineers at Malvern would soon guide the Cold War's radar networks, missile warning systems, and satellites orbiting far above the Earth. The ghosts of Liechtenstein's pulses would echo in every radar sweep, every stealth experiment, every jamming pod that hummed in later wars, and beneath all of it, the same principle endured. Every signal reveals, every emission betrays. To see is to be seen. The moral shadow, but there was also a darker lesson. The intelligence that saved lives also cost them. The countermeasures that blinded Germany's night fighters enabled the firestorms of Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin. The success of the invisible war was measured in cities destroyed and civilians lost. For the men who built the machines, that truth lingered long after the victory parades. R.V. Jones once said, "We won the war of the airwaves, but I am not sure we understood the price." It is a statement that resonates beyond its time. Science, once unshackled by necessity, rarely returns to innocence. The tools of preservation become tools of power. The boundary between defense and domination blurs. The engineers of the 1940s could not have known it, but they were writing the first chapter of a new kind of warfare, one that would never again sleep. The legacy of the Ju-88. The captured Ju-88 at Dice was, in physical terms, just an aircraft, aluminum, engines, circuits, but in symbolic terms it was something greater, a messenger from the future. Its radar, the Fuji-202 Liechtenstein, represented both the triumph and the tragedy of human ingenuity. It proved how far science could reach when driven by fear, and how that same science could liberate those who understood it. Every modern radar, every electronic countermeasure, every stealth coating carries a trace of that night in 1943, when British engineers powered up the black box in a quiet hangar and saw the enemy's heartbeat flicker across the screen. That pulse connected the world of propellers and gunmetal to the world of silicon and code. From that flicker began a lineage that stretches into today's drones, satellites, and cyber systems, the endless struggle between detection and deception. Knowledge as weapon, knowledge as warning. The story of the captured night fighter reminds us of a truth older than any technology. Knowledge is never neutral. It can defend, enlighten, or destroy, often all at once. The British engineers who decoded the Liechtenstein radar did so to protect their nation. But in doing so, they also advanced the machinery of war for all humanity. That paradox lies at the heart of progress. In the crucible of survival, innovation becomes inevitable. The only question is what it serves once peace returns. And so the legacy of that discovery is not only in the radars that followed, but in the questions it left behind. Can understanding save us from the things we build to survive? Can mastery of the invisible ever coexist with moral clarity? These are the questions that every scientist, every soldier, every strategist inherits from that generation. The final image, imagine the scene once more. A dim hangar in the English Midlands. The captured Ju-88 resting under tarps, the hum of a generator, the slow bloom of green light on a cathode ray tube. Around it, a handful of tired men watch in silence, not with triumph, but with recognition. They have just opened the future. Outside, the night is calm. The wind moves through the hedges. No searchlights, no engines, only the soft, rhythmic pulse of a machine that once hunted in the dark, now silent, disarmed, and understood. In that stillness lies the essence of the entire war of the air. The night was conquered not by brighter lights, but by those who learned how to read the dark. If you found this story as haunting and fascinating as we did, the moment when a single captured aircraft changed the course of an entire war, then don't let the history fade into static. Subscribe for more cinematic, fact-driven documentaries on the hidden science and human stories behind World War II. Like this video if you believe history's greatest turning points often happen far from the battlefield. Comment below, what other secret wartime technologies or captured discoveries should we uncover next? And if you want early access to upcoming deep dive scripts and behind-the-scenes breakdowns, check the links in the description.